All right, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, GRIDSMART version 1912, Features and Updates. My name is Kristen Bridgers. I'm part of the marketing team here at GRIDSMART, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. That simply means that I'll be fielding any questions that you all might have to our presenters and panelists today, and I'll be keeping track of and managing our time. Today we have three presenters from our software engineering team, John Isaac, Andrew Hall, and Drew Edwards. Each will be discussing the different updates and uses of GRIDSMART version 1912. Should you have any questions during the webinar, we're going to ask you to please use the Q&A feature. To find that feature, you can navigate to the control bar, which may be at the top or bottom of your screen. Go ahead and press Q&A and the Q&A window will open. Type your question there and one of the members of our panel will type an answer, or your question will be answered aloud at the conclusion of the presentation. Please note that you also have the availability to upvote a question by clicking the thumbs up button below the active question. We will be sending a follow-up email with helpful links and resources at the conclusion of today's webinar. That will also include a recording of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew Hall to get started. Andrew?
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. On behalf of myself and the rest of the software team, we're excited to get this 1912 webinar kick-started and talk a little bit about what we've added. But before we do that, I'm going to take a minute and talk a little bit about some of the stuff that has come out in the past two releases, versions 19.3 and 19.10, to recap some of what we've done in the past and continue to enjoy talking about. We're going to start with talking about the box. So in 19.3, we released the box, which is a mechanism for discriminating bikes and vehicles within the center of the intersection, or the box. What the box allows you to do is to place green extensions while cyclists are at their most vulnerable. By doing this, we believe we're being most safe and most efficient of all detection systems, because we're able to track vehicles as they move through the intersection. We've got a little video here to demonstrate the functionality of the box. So you're going to see here in a second, a platoon of cyclists are going to move through the center of the intersection. And note that vehicles aren't activating this zone right now. We don't have it configured for vehicle detection. But as soon as these cyclists enter the center of the intersection and are detected in the box, we're going to activate that zone and place a green extension for those cyclists' safety. And then the moment they clear the box, we're going to drop that call and allow the intersection to stop placing the green extension and continue to service the rest of the movements there within the intersection. That segues nicely into the next bit that I want to talk about, which came with 19.10, which included the change in the way we license these features. We don't believe that safety should be a premium feature. Initially, the box was part of the Performance Plus package, but we've changed that. The box and pedestrian detection zones are now included with the base system. No upcharge, no additional fees, and that's because we think that municipalities should have the tools to keep their citizens out of harm's way while they're in the intersection. It's safety first and efficiency by default. That's the next thing I'd like to talk about is the modules. So as you see here, we've got a table that shows the different modules on the left and all the different features that can be enabled by them along the top. You note that the box and pedestrians are enabled across the suite of modules that we have available. One new thing that we've added, you'll notice, is the streams module. Starting with 19.12, streams can now be purchased independent from the rest of the GRIDSMART features, so that you can do remote monitoring, network video recording, and any other application that you might utilize streams for. We're really excited about that change and know a lot of people have been asking for it. One of the big changes with 19.12 that we announced in 19.10 is the end of support for the insecure HTTP protocol. 19.12 implements this change and now only supports HTTPS. So what does that mean for you as users? Starting with 19.12, users must authenticate with either the admin, publish, or read-only credentials in order to access any site. That applies to both the device manager and the client, excuse me. That's going to require users to be set up, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this webinar.
All right, thanks, Andrew. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about our new out-of-the-box experience with a new 1912 processor. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we were in compliance with is a new state law in California, California State Bill 327, which basically states that any internet-connected device can't ship with a default password. So one thing you'll notice, and what you see on the right-hand side of your screen is the new a new card that will ship with the processor. But we want to walk you through the process a little bit to make sure that you guys understand our new process for configuring processors outside the box. So we will no longer ship with default user accounts and passwords. So before you can access a new GS2, you'll need to set a password for an admin account. The way you do that is you'll jump on you'll connect to the GS2 through the laptop port on the front of your processor, and then connect to the device manager at the IP address that you see over here. And then you'll set a new password. You'll see a screen that looks like the one on the right, which is asking you to set your password for this admin account. Now, it's very important that you note the password and you keep it in a really safe place. We recommend, and we use ourselves on our team, 1Password, which is a great tool that allows you to manage and store your passwords securely in an application. And then you can retrieve them whenever you need it. We'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. But once you've set the administrator password, you'll be able to log in and then use the device manager or the client as you normally do. One thing just want to be clear about is that in some previous versions of our software, we've shipped with an admin, a publish, and an Aldus account pre-configured on the device with default passwords. When you get a new 1912 system out of the box, there's only an admin account on the processor, and the password has to be set before you can access the device. And then once you do that, you can add any number of users with any roles that you'd like for your organization. And we recommend, if you have different users, maybe a distributor, or if you'd like to have, someone from GRIDSMART access your device, create a user account for those users on your processor and sort of manage your access that way. And again, just to sort of reiterate, 1912 coming out of the box, we're after a factory reset, which we'll talk a little bit more about a factory reset later in the webinar. You'll have just an admin password, or just an admin account, excuse me. And that admin account can never be deleted. And that password, again, is very important that you save it because it's likely an RMA process if you lose that password. If you're upgrading to 1912 from version 6.9 or 19.3, 1910, any user accounts that you have configured on your GS2 will be preserved. So you don't have to worry about that or go back in and do any of that kind of stuff. What we're talking about here is just for out of the box new processors. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John Isaac, our Director of Software Engineering, to talk a little bit about LDAP and user management.
Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about this today, and we'll kind of dig in here and talk about LDAP. One of the things that when I was at Intersect last year, a bunch of people came up to me, and one of the biggest takeaways that we had was that they noticed we had started changing the way we did user management on the device, and a lot of that was dictated by a lot of you folks out there that have come to us and said, we needed to improve some of our security practices on the device. And we fully agreed, and that's something that we really took to heart in a lot of different ways. But also at the same time, when we started adding users, the message that I got was, hey, we've got 100 of these devices out there. How in the world do we keep track of username and passwords for a bunch of different devices? And for those applications where you have a whole bunch of units, we implemented a protocol called LDAP, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. You may not be familiar with this in particular, but this is actually a standard, and I'll talk a little bit more about what it is. But this is something that you can set up on your network, have a centralized database, and doing so, what you'll be able to do is go in there and set up the users one time, log in, and any GS2 that you have in your fleet, you'll be able to access it. So we felt like that was a very important step in kind of centralizing user management, making it easy to onboard new technicians or have different user accounts on these machines. This doesn't replace the admin account. The admin account, what we recommend is set up an admin account, save the password somewhere, and store it away, and set up other accounts for other folks, maybe your contractors or maybe a GRIDSMART technician or something that might access the unit. That main admin account, you want to store it away and make sure that it's safeguarded. But anyway, with the LDAP, what we basically have is there's a couple different things. It's centralized user management. We have what we call role-based authentication. And all that means basically is you can, based on which user account you log in under, you can either have admin privileges, which allows you to do anything on the device. You can have privileges where you can do publish events, which is really changing things for the traffic configuration, and then a read-only account. The other thing this does is that if you have a large enterprise and you want to be able to see who's logging into your devices and stuff, you can log all that stuff to a centralized location with your server and keep track of who's actually accessing the device. The requirements for this, there are a few requirements, and again, this isn't for every single customer, but for ones that need it, there are some things that you can do. The general requirements are that you're going to have the processors that work together. You'll have a DNS server set up on your site. You'll set up SSL certificates. And then there's two different standards that we can support. We can support Microsoft Active Directory. And if you're familiar with the concept of a domain, basically what we're talking about there, or you can use just what we call the open LDAP standard, which again is an open standard that's used throughout the industry for mapping things together. Now, the way this works is if you have local users now, nothing really changes as far as how this works, but you can add LDAP to it. And in addition to the local user, you can also have these LDAP users. And these user accounts will actually be on a different server. And the way this works is that when you log in, it will check to see if that user is a local user. And if it is, it just kind of goes on like it did before. If the password's valid, you log in. If it's not, then it's going to be a login failure, just as you would expect. But if you have LDAP enabled, what it will do is it'll actually query the LDAP server. And if it is an LDAP user, then it will actually authenticate on the LDAP server, cache the password up on the GS2, and then go ahead and if it's a valid user, it'll log you in. The significance of having that password cached up is very important, because what that does is that it does have to go over the network the first time to kind of get that user information, but then it stores it locally. And if you log in again, it doesn't have to go back through that complete authentication process. And it doesn't actually store the password. It just knows that you've been authenticated. So it's kind of what we call a trust relationship is basically the kind of the terminology. So and this is kind of if in your corporation or a business you have to log in on a domain or whatever, it's basically using the exact same mechanism. Now, if you notice here on this screen, this is kind of interesting. So I'm looking at the user panel here. I have an admin user, but if you look in the right-hand corner here, I've actually logged in as test user. So that right there, I've got LDAP set up. That user doesn't exist there, but that user was actually set up on the LDAP server. And if you look here, I'm actually using, in our office, we've got a Microsoft Active Directory, and we also have another appliance, which is called Synology, which makes a very nice appliance. You can buy it for a few $100, and it's got an LDAP server built in. It's very easy to set up. And for some of you folks that might be interested in doing this but don't have a big IT department, want something you can probably set up on your own, this is a really good option. And we love this device. I've been using these things personally for years, and they're very versatile. But what I'm doing here basically is I'm just going into the Synology server, and I basically added that test user. I gave it a username and password, and I saved it. And then any of my GS2s that are using the LDAP server can log in with whatever credentials I've set up for that particular user. Now, one of the things on the LDAP server when you set it up, if you remember, we talked about roles. We have an admin user, we have a publish user, we have a read-only user, which basically those particular users can do different things. And just to recap, the admin user can pretty much change the network settings. They can pretty much do anything on the device. A publish user is basically allowed to do anything that kind of affects traffic. So they could do a publish, they could update phase channel maps, which we'll show you here in a little bit, things like that. And then of course we've got a read-only user. The nice thing when you set up LDAP is you can actually set up groups. And so when you set up that user on your LDAP system, you can actually tell it what group on the GS2 that it has access to. And that mapping occurs automatically when they log in. And if you look here, I'm back on my little Synology device here, but I have some user groups set up here. If you notice, I have a GS admin, a GS publish, and a GS read only. And this particular test user, I have him checked off as an admin user. So when he logs in to the GS2 or any GS2, he would have those admin privileges. And again, I mentioned this before, but as far as server options go, Microsoft Active Directory is a one that will support any open LDAP server, which again you can download the software and install it. But if you're like me and you don't have time to fool with all that stuff and you want a good inexpensive solution, you can buy a Synology NAS and use that. And by the way, you can also use that if you're running streams. It does have a video recorder on it, so you can actually use it to archive video, and you can use it for some other things on your network. So, and again, literally with the way we have it set up, once you kind of everything kind of laid out how you're going to do it, you can get this set up and running in a few minutes once you have it up on your network. And this is the setup screen we have in here, and it looks like there's a lot of stuff on here. And quite frankly, there's a lot of fields in here, but most of these are going to get filled in automatically when you type in the name of your LDAP server. The thing about this is the way we set this up was that we didn't want to make this complicated. If it's complicated to do it, then it's going to be really hard to set up. You're not going to want to do it. And we didn't want to make it if you got 100 devices that you have to go and reconfigure on every single device. So what the idea is that you set this up on one device, get it working properly, test it. And the other thing is, and we don't really have any screens to show this, but we've added some debugging tools in the actual diagnostics, so you can look at log files, you can check things logging in. So if you do get this set up and you're having problems with it, we can help you troubleshoot. And I also would recommend that if this is something you want to set up and you don't have a lot of experience with it, we do have a lot of documentation, but please reach out to us. We're more than happy to set up a time to talk to you about it, help you get it set up, and kind of walk you through the process. Now, once you do have one unit set up and working, the next slide will show you here, we actually built an export and an import function. So once you get your LDAP configuration set up on one GS2, you simply export that, and then you can go to the next units and import it back in as you're setting them up. And that's all you really have to do. You'll up and running, all your users will be valid. Now, if I want to change a password back in the office, I go into my LDAP server, I change that password, and next time somebody logs in, it'll be applied to all the units I have out in the field. And that's what we have for the LDAP function.
Thanks, John. This is Andrew again. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the functionality that's supported by the device manager to be able to access the client on the GS2. So with GRIDSMART software and the device manager, we've implemented something that we call a captive user. This is an account on the processor that enables access to the client on the GS2 desktop. That's the whole intent of it, and is designed to meet the need to adhere to specs that require either keyboard and monitor access at the cabinet, or for whatever reason to be able to access the client on the desktop remotely. The preferred mechanism, and the one we always like to recommend, is using either a laptop or a networked GS2 so that you can access it through the device manager or the client remotely rather than on the GS2, but this is there for those use cases where there is no other choice. You have to be able to access it on the GS2. What this does is it secures the GS2 by preventing any access to the critical functionality that is needed to actuate the intersection. Alongside of this change is that VNC is no longer going to be supported. We instead are supporting RDP, which we released previously, but now it is the only option for remote access. It is a native Windows application that comes free with all Windows installations, and also has free downloads for other operating systems like Mac OS. If you've got any Mac users in your ecosystem, it's free to use and is really a smooth user experience for customers and users to be able to access the desktop when they need to. You can use the device manager to manage the account for RDP. You can see here that you can enable it or disable it. By default, RDP is not enabled. So you have to come in here and into this screen, enable RDP for remote access. And the first time that you enable it, you're going to be required to set a password. Now, I want to be clear, this password is only for accessing the desktop. This is not for logging into the device manager. This is not for logging into the client. This is just to gain access to the GS2 desktop so that you can run the client. Do not confuse the two. And again, just to be clear, I want to reiterate that. This is for accessing the desktop, not for logging into any of our other software. So what does that look like whenever you launch RDP and go access it? For those of you that are in enterprise environments, you might already be familiar with this, but if you're not, I'd like to walk through it and sort of show what it looks like. If you've ever used VNC, it'll look pretty familiar. You've got a computer here. That's where you put the address that you want to connect to. So it'll either be the IP address, or if you have a domain set up, you use the domain name for that GS2, and the username that you're going to use to access it. For the captive user, that is GRIDSMART, all lowercase, and it is case sensitive. Once you've input that information, you click connect, you're going to see the password prompt pop up. That is the password we just talked about. That is for accessing the desktop and nothing else. You'll input that, click OK, at which point you'll be logged into the desktop, and you will see this demonstration here in just a second, where you can then launch the client and the device manager. So from there, you can launch the client or the device manager, do what you need to do with the keyboard and monitor, or configure the intersection. Hand it back over to John to talk a little bit about flashing yellow and channel mapping.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So one of the other things that we have that we've done is, and we started this with 1910, was we added the concept of channel mapping. And the motivation behind this is that a couple different applications. As we started seeing flashing yellow, people implementing flashing yellow in the intersection, we wanted a way to be able to support flashing yellow arrow. The other scenario for this is that if you have an intersection, maybe it's a fairly large intersection, you actually need a couple of GS2s, and you're running, say, an ATC cabinet, and you want to use all 32 channels, you could actually run two different GRIDSMART units and actually map channels from the upper 16, for example, or the upper 16 to channel 17 to 32. You could map those basically on one processor and use the other processor to use channels 1 through 16. What we did is, the first thing we did is in the device manager, we added something called channel groups to display those. And basically what that is that if you're familiar with the SDLC protocol, on TS2, it's going to be message 0. On ITS, I think it's 62, 81, 83, if I remember correct, 67, 81, 83. But those messages basically are going to be the channel, they call it channel driver outputs, or the outputs of the channels on the device. And there are basically 16 channels. Each channel has basically a state of red, green, or yellow. And we actually capture that message on our controller, or on our device, and we display those actual states of that. And in this case, we have I know this is a TS2 because I only see 16 channels. If this was an ITS ATC cabinet, I would actually see all 32 channels. Now, what you can do with this then is we have an editor, and you can actually go in here. Can you go back one, please? Thank you. What you can do is you can go into this editor, and you can see exactly how it's mapped. And by default, we have a bunch of default maps that are in here that'll support all different modes of flashing yellow. But you can actually customize it to set it up any way you want. And if I'm looking at this right now, like if I look at, most of these are pretty uninteresting. But if I look at phase 1, for example, The flashing yellow is actually going to come from channel group 9 yellow. Of course, phase 3 is going to come from channel 10 yellow. And again, this is just standard flashing yellow mode G, which is part of the NEMA specifications. And I believe most of these modes will map to Caltrans modes as well. But there are some instances where maybe you just have to do something really weird. And it just, for whatever reason, you got to work with what you've got. We completely understand that. So what you can do after you select these maps, if you want to modify it, you can actually go in and actually edit the map. So we added a feature now where you can go in and actually configure the map for each phase. You can map it to any channel you want, and you can do anything, whether it makes sense or not. We allow you to do it here, so you can kind of customize and map those channels any way that you need to for whatever application. In reality, probably one of the common things that we were asked about is a scenario where you might have an intersection. Maybe you're going to run mode G, but you want to turn off maybe the flashing yellow arrow on phases 5 and 7, or you don't actually have them on all 4. So you could actually use this to go in and change that. It'll update it immediately on the fly, and then any reports, anything, anywhere you look at the phases in the client, you're going to see this reflected accordingly. And I've got a little demo here that just we'll walk through. And what we're doing here basically, let me set this up. We're going to basically we're starting out with flashing yellow. We're going to go ahead and disable the flashing yellow on phase 7 because we don't want that. We don't want a flashing yellow on that particular phase. And we're going to do that on a live intersection here. This has actually been recorded from a controller we had in our office, and we'll go ahead and run it and walk you through it. So we just come in here. We're going to go ahead and uncheck flashing yellow. We're going to save. And if you watch phase 7, if you notice now, we don't see it's gone there. And it'll basically update and operate just as it normally would from before. And that's pretty much how it works. So, and of course we can go and set it back, either clear it out or set it back to another phase, and it's back to where it was before.
Thanks, John. This is Drew again, here to talk about a couple of improvements to the device manager that we have coming in 1912. Probably one of the first things you'll notice when you get a chance to upgrade is that the navigation, we've moved a lot of navigation into what we call our control panel. We kind of declutter the left side a little bit there, and just wanted to point out that some of the less frequently used items you can find here, things like network settings, date time settings, LDAP, which John talked about, user management is very important. Some of our security features and software update, which we'll talk about here in just a few more minutes. We added some new diagnostic information as well. We have historical camera frame rate data now on the camera tab, which will look a little bit different as well. But that gives you an idea of something that you can take a look at and see if anything maybe is amiss with your cameras if they're dropping frames. We added some temperature logging to the diagnostics as well, and it goes historically as well. So that's another vector you can look at through our diagnostics panel to assess any issues you may be having with your processor, and also not pictured is your modem signal strength as well, which is another great troubleshooting piece. A few more improvements we have the ability to turn on ICMP or ping, which is something that we've heard from customers would like to be able to use for monitoring software. Also, some streaming software requires it. So you can now go into the network settings and enable the ICMP if that's a use case that you have. You're able to change the system's host name. By default, our processors ship with the serial number as the default host name. But if you want to go in and change that for any reason, you can do that as well. We also have some information that you can find in the client is now available as well in the device manager for our RTSP streams. So you can go in and find the streaming URL for that for any software you might be running. or any other use cases you might have. Another new feature we have is factory reset. And if there's some distributors on the call, this is probably more applicable to our distributors and some internal folks, but wanted to go over this just so we can clear up any just let you know about the new feature. Again, this is dovetails with what we talked about with the out-of-box experience, in that this would make your GS2 compliant with the California state law about default passwords. But what this does is this will effectively return your processor to the state you would get it from a brand new processor from the factory with 1912, excuse me. And one of the things that we want to make clear on our call today is in the client, in the GRIDSMART client, there is a feature called factory reset, which has been renamed to configuration reset. So if you see that in the processor, you've seen that in the client software before, that just has been renamed to be a little clearer. So you want to use the factory reset if you're moving to a processor to a new site, or you want to just completely erase user data, any users you have configured, any traffic data on your processor, any network settings, all of those things. It basically wipes your GS2 completely clean. The configuration reset is used, say if you're moving or removing cameras on your system, you can think of that as something that it will preserve your users, your network settings, and those other things. And then once you've reset, if you do factory reset your processor, it's the process to reconfigure your GS2 is the same as we went over in the earlier part of the presentation, talking about the out-of-box experience. So just to drive it home, a factory reset will be a fairly destructive action. You don't want to do it lightly, but there may be a use case if you want to move your processor to a brand new intersection, say, and you want to start from scratch, or restore your processor to its factory default condition. Something else that's brand new here, and or not brand new, but something that we've spent a fair amount of time trying to refine and make a little more transparent, is the software updates. And you can now update software for your GS2 by connecting to the device manager over the network with a laptop port on the front of your device. This is available after upgrading to 1910. We had a feature in 19.3 that allowed you to do this update, but we felt like it wasn't transparent enough, and wanted to make it a little bit easier for users to use, to sort of see what was happening during a software update process. So what the way that this will work is you'll get a securely signed update file provided by us. You can download those from cloud as well, and you stage it for an update. And then once you press the install update button after you've uploaded your file, you'll start to see the progress displayed in a window. If any of you are Mac users or even Windows users, this is similar to what you see when you're updating operating system software. So it'll sort of let you know what's happening behind the scenes in the process, and then see some progress. And again, this is something that we believe in our company is transparency, and we hope that this is a more transparent update process. Once the update is completed, you'll get a notification window that lets you know that everything's gone according to plan. You hit OK, and then you'll be prompted to log back into your device manager, log back into your processor. And the entire process, the entire update process takes just a few minutes to do. If we release a patch, this is the method that you have to use to apply them. USB sticks won't be used to apply software patches in the future. And I believe Andrew's going to take over here and mention something for our API users.
Thank you, Drew. The last thing we wanted to hit on here is for any of our customers out there that utilize the device's API to pull data and telemetry from the systems in the intersection. We know we've got a handful of places that like to use this heavily, and really want to make sure that you guys are aware of the changes that are coming with the HTTPS change and authentication in 1912. We highly recommend that before upgrading to 1912, you get your systems up to 1910 and test your software using HTTPS and authentication. You can enable this, as you see in the screenshot here, on 1910 by clicking over to S and start testing against systems in your municipality today to make sure that you're ready once 1912 is available and you can start applying the upgrade. This isn't a huge change. We don't expect it to be cumbersome to make this change, but we do want you to be aware, and we're glad to help. If you have any questions about this, please do reach out to GRIDSMART support. We talk to them daily, and we constantly have our sort of finger on the pulse of what's coming back from them. So if there's an issue with this, or you have a question about the API usage or how to authenticate for that matter, don't hesitate to let us know. We are here for you, and we definitely want this to be as smooth of an experience as possible. And now I'd like to take a minute to sort of recap a little bit of what we talked about here today. We looked back at some of the safety features that we released with 19.3 and made free with 19.10, and just continue to improve upon with the box and pedestrians. Drew covered some of the device manager improvements, the control panel and diagnostics, the remote update procedure, and improvements that you get back while you're updating through the device manager. John covered a little bit about, actually quite a bit, about LDAP and centralized user management and how that eases municipalities' ability to go out and apply user changes to hundreds of GRIDSMART systems in the field and not have to go out to each system and manage those users in a cumbersome way. We talked about accessing the client on the GS2. Again, that's really to meet specs for some cities. We know that's a requirement. We don't recommend it because really the best and the easiest way is going to be through the device manager and the client. But again, to meet your needs, that feature's there and you can get it. So I sort of talked about, I got ahead of myself and talked about the update improvements there. And again, just drive home the point about the API. If you're using it, you need to test it with HTTPS with 1910 before you upgrade, just to make sure that you're ready and no issues come. It is a breaking change, but not a difficult one to overcome. And at this point, I think we're ready to open it up to a live Q&A. Kristen?
Thanks, Andrew. We want to thank you all for joining us today. And while they're getting ready for the Q&A, we want to remind you that we will be sending a follow-up to this presentation with helpful links and resources, which will include a recording of today's webinar. So check your email for that information. If you're interested in more webinars like this one, follow us on social media at GRIDSMART Tech on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. You can also stay in the know by signing up to receive our emails. That is, if you don't already, email your request to gridsmartmarketing@cubic.com and we will get you signed up. You can find that email address in the comments now. We're about to drop that there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into these questions. Before we get the ones that are currently open, John, we did see a couple come in earlier while you were speaking to LDAP, and they were asking if it will support Radius.
Yeah, and that's a good question. We currently don't support Radius with for user login. And that's something we definitely would consider at some point in the future. But right now we started out with LDAP. That was seemed to be low-hanging fruit, but that would definitely be something we take a look at in the future. There was another question here about SolarWinds software, and again, if it supports Open LDAP, and I don't know specifically about that particular implementation, but if it supports LDAP, it should work. So that it is standards based and should work with any LDAP standard that's out there.
Thank you, John. We do have one coming in from Jeremy. We may have to translate a little bit or get a little bit of clarification from Jeremy, but he's asking, are we able to view multiple GRIDSMART clients at the same time on the same computer? We have several TVs connected to one computer and would like to view different intersections.
So Kristen, this is one that I do understand, and I'll sort of clarify for those that are on the webinar listening. What Jeremy's asking is, right now the client can only be run once on the same computer. That was really a resource issue early on in the days of the GRIDSMART client, and is one that we've kept the same. Yeah, it's a great use case that he's requesting, to be able to display multiple clients on the same computer across multiple TVs. The computers have gotten a lot more powerful, and this is definitely one that we'll consider. And if it's an extremely valuable use case, I see that somebody thumbs up it. So there's at least one other person out there that requested. We prioritize based on user feedback. So this is something that if you highly value it, please do reach out to your FAE or sales, and we'll gladly support it.
I'd make one comment on that as well too. The other option that you could use now to do that would be to set up a network video recorder with and stream the cameras from the various GS2s, and then you could actually record them and have them up on multiple on a display panel. But again, the feature request is valid, and we'd certainly take a look at that.
And guys, it looks like as you were answering that, it got several more upvotes. We have 11, so we'll take note of that for sure. Thank you, Jeremy, for asking that question. We have one from Sean. Will I have to purchase a certificate for each of my devices?
That is a great question, and I'm glad you asked that. And I had some slides in here on certificates, and honestly, I took them out because I didn't want to get over technical with this, but I will mention a couple things. We do have quite a bit of documentation in our user guide, which I think we'll get you a link to, that does have information about setting this up. But the answer is you can purchase certificates if you want to, but we don't actually do that. What you can do if you'd like is you can actually set up your own certificate authority. And while that may seem kind of overwhelming or daunting, it's actually not too terribly difficult to do. You can download, there's some software, basically OpenSSL software. If you have that software, then you have the ability to generate and sign your own certificates. So, that would be something that if you're interested in doing, reach out to you. We'd be happy to do it. There's a little bit of setup work to do it, but once you kind of have it in place, it's very easy to do. And you can have private domains, so you can set up like we set up gridsmart.eng in our office, and we use that. We have gridsmart.local. You can set up your own domain. You can have certificates. So yeah, you don't have to purchase certificates. You certainly can if you want to. It's an easy way to do it. But if you don't want to do that, I'd highly recommend you just set up your own and build your own, do your own certificates.
Thank you, John. Alrighty, y'all. We did answer some of your questions in a typed format. If you are participating and you saw a question that may have disappeared, go to your answered window and you may see it answered in a written format there. We do have a couple more minutes left in time, so if you have any more questions, please go ahead and submit them now. We have 3 of our software developers here on this presentation, which we don't normally have, so now is your chance to get those questions in front of them. We just have one come in from Eric. I currently only have one GRIDSMART IS that was installed last August. How do I determine what SW version I'm running?
Yeah, so Eric's asking about how to access the version. There are a couple of ways you can do that, Eric. You can either see it in the client. It'll show at the top of the site in the title bar, and in the device manager in the top bar. Once you log in, you'll see the firmware version that's running on the GS2.
Thank you, Andrew. Alrighty, we'll give it just another minute in case somebody's currently typing a question to go ahead and get their questions submitted here. I do want to remind everybody that we did drop that email address, gridsmartmarketing@cubic.com, into the comments section. If you would like to register to be a part of our email list for future webinars or product updates, go ahead and send us a request to that email address right now. We have one coming in from John. Can you still share a video stream without the use of the client?
Yes, you definitely can. So with the streams module, you're able to take the streams URL that Drew sort of showed off a little bit of a screenshot there earlier. You can get the RTSP stream and plug that into any RTSP standards compliant stream consumer and a network video recorder or some other network device that will allow you to consume that stream without ever having to use the client.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, Derek asks, is there a plan to support multicast in streams?
Probably not on the processor itself, but if you did want to set up multicast, you could have a multicast server and use feed the stream from the unit. That would probably be a recommended way to do that.
Thanks, John. And one last one that we have right now is from Alan. He asks, what exactly is the GRIDSMART device manager?
I'll take that one. So what the device manager basically is, it's a web interface that is that you can access basically from a web browser. And what we basically have done is we've taken a lot of the functionality that we had in the client. We put it in there so that you can do network settings and some basic setup. And prior to having the device manager, if you were out in the field and you wanted to set up a device, you actually had to hook up cameras to set up network settings. There were some other things you had to do. And we wanted to kind of make that process as simple as we could. So we set up the device manager. We set it up so that you can go in and set up network settings. You can check the cameras to see if they're working, do a lot of preliminary stuff without having to actually be running the client. The other thing is that by having it be a web browser, there's some other things that we're going to be able to do in the future with that to kind of make things a little bit easier. We'll still have the client and be able to do some things with that, but we're also looking at that for some other possibilities. So that was kind of the main reason we set it up, was to make it easier to set the device up. But it's just another piece of software that we have that you would use in conjunction with the client to work with work with the system.
Thanks, John. All right, we have Jody on the line. Hey, Jody. TrafficWare ATMS added an icon for the GRIDSMART unit. Can you add 2 cameras as separate icons for a location?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I guess we could probably do some research and get back to you, our TrafficWare folks. Does anybody, Andrew or Drew, are you familiar with that?
I don't believe that's possible at this point in time, but I know they are continuously working on integrating. So that might be something that will come out in a future release, but I don't think it's possible today, but we will definitely clarify and reach out, Jody, to get an answer on that question.
Jody, I've taken note of your question too, and we'll get that answered for you when we can. We have Brad asking, can you update to 1912 with a USB stick?
Yeah, absolutely. You can use a USB stick, or you can do it over with the device manager. So either one of those is supported. One of the things too that we started doing in 1910 with the updates, and it was again just so people are aware of exactly what's going on when you're doing an update. I think in the past we just kind of we just scanned the lights, and then when they were done, they all went green. But what happens when you use an update stick, you'll see when the actual update is being transferred, you'll still see those rolling the rolling lights across the front panel as you did before. But once the update actually starts running, you'll see the actual lights on the front panel kind of walking along in kind of a progress mode, where you can see how far along it is. And when it gets all the way down to the end, you know the update's done. So that update will actually match exactly what you see in the device manager. So you can actually put the update stick in on the USB, log into the device manager, and watch the progress as well. We wanted to make that as transparent as possible, but yeah, you can still use an update stick.
Thank you. All right, one from Steve. If I currently have the Performance module, can I just add streams only, or do I need to upgrade to Performance Plus?
You can absolutely only add streams. No need to go to Performance Plus if it doesn't have a feature or a bit of functionality that you want. Streams can be added completely separate from the rest of them, or in addition to other ones that you already have.
Thank you. William Brown asks, how do we update our software cannot find on your website?
So William, if you go to support.gridsmart.com, we've got a great knowledge base in there. And one of the articles is the user guide, which has a complete set of steps on how to apply updates to the processor.
And it does require a cloud account to be able to download the software. So if you don't have that, you can request an account to do that as well.
So William, that was support.gridsmart.com. So we can drop that link to you should you need. Again, you can use that GRIDSMART marketing at cubic.com if you have further questions about that. Derek Hilbert asks, if you update client to 1912, will you be able to see GS2 processor older versions, including 6.9?
Absolutely. So the client that we release is always backwards compatible. So if we release 1912, you can see 1910 and prior, all the way back to some versions that I hope no one's ever running anymore, frankly. So yes, the answer is yes.
Alrighty, and one last one. Do we have any future plans to display the detection overlay in streams?
We don't at the moment, but that's actually it's a pretty good request, and if that's something you're interested in, we could take that up as a feature request and take a look at it.
Eric says that he's on GRIDSMART Cloud and is only seeing version 1910. Can you all help him locate?
Yeah. So okay. So that's the problem there. One thing we didn't mention is we have not released 1912 yet. It will probably be out in the next couple of weeks. The reason we did this earlier, usually we release the software and then do the webinar. The reason we didn't do that today is because we wanted to kind of give you guys a heads up on some of the stuff that's coming, because especially with the password reset stuff and some things like that. So it will be coming, and there'll be an announcement coming out when we actually do release the software. So we're pretty much ready to get it put out here in the next week or so, and everything's on track. But we wanted to kind of give everybody a preview of the features beforehand, and that's why you're not seeing it. I apologize for we didn't clarify that as part of the webinar here today.
Yes. Thank you, Eric, for that question.
That was a good question.
And it looks like Paul submitted a question that was just answered. So, alrighty, we have 5 more minutes. So if you have any questions that you were hoping to sneak in, go ahead and do so now. Otherwise, we'll let everybody get back to the rest of their day. Thank you, John, Andrew, and Drew for your presentation today. I know I certainly learned a lot, and it seems like everyone is really excited about this new version that's going to be rolling out in the next couple of weeks. Alrighty, so it doesn't look like we have any more questions rolling in, so we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, we'll follow up with and email you all for a recording of this webinar, as well as some links to some helpful resources for you. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.